started with, and a little bit arbitrary, but still it's helpful. The little books that we had talked about 15 time periods of the Old Testament. And if you look at this chart, and for a number of years I shrunk one and kept it in the front of my Bible, because if someone says, okay, we're going to read from Habakkuk, a lot of times we don't know exactly where that is, and you can kind of glance down and kind of see time-wise where those things are taking place. But if you look in the upper left-hand corner, these first 7 time periods are really easy to follow because they just coincide with the books that are there. And our chart had pre-diluvian and antediluvian, and that doesn't mean anything to me, so I put pre-flood and post-flood. And so those first time periods are the biblical time periods before the flood, after the flood. Number 3, the patriarchal time will start with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and actually will continue on till the covenant at Mount Sinai. And then the people go into Egypt, 70 people go in, and they come out in absolute multitude. And so that's going to be Egyptian captivity, the wanderings in the wilderness. And then when you come to the book of Joshua, the conquest of Canaan, and Judges. And so, like I said, all of those just kind of neatly fall into order, and you can kind of roughly, automatically kind of know, biblically, time-wise, this is where you locate those things. When you come to number 8, this is the United Kingdom, and this is going to be Saul, David, and Solomon. And you'll begin to start seeing then how the books fall into place. And we've always said Samuel anoints the first king, literally. And so if you want to read about Saul, you can just always think, oh, I can go to 1 Samuel because he anoints the first king. He also anoints the second king, that's David. And if you look under time period number 9, the divided kingdom, in the books of history, it's 1 Kings 12. So mentally I always say the 12 tribes split in 1 Kings 12. So Solomon's going to be just before that, so he'll be the first 11 chapters of 1 Kings. And then we're going to have our books of poetry. Psalms, 73 of the Psalms have attributed to David in the heading. Twice in the book of Acts, a reference is made to David wrote, and these are Psalms that don't have an actual heading on them. So it's easy to say half of the Psalms are written during the time of David. However, what's significant, though, is that, and this was a part of our Wednesday night, the oldest psalm, according to the heading, and I go back this way, is written by Moses, and so that's going to be approximately 1500, and they're still writing songs when they come back from captivity, but the heart of the book of Psalms is there. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, all associated with Solomon. And as we read through our narrated Bible, there are obviously editorial choices that have to be made. The time period for the book of Job is back to the time of the patriarchs. And if I had been putting the things in order, I would actually put Job back there. People wonder and question with all the things, why God, why did these things happen? In our narrated Bible, we're about to come to Job, and the editor, and some people feel like, the reflection of the questions and the questioning of God, which is very similar from Habakkuk, then Job is placed later, but the time period in which the book takes place goes all the way back to the patriarchs, and that takes care of our books of poetry. When you come to the divided kingdom, then our primary prophets and speaking prophets, sometimes called oral prophets, are going to be Elijah and then Elisha, and that will take us in through 2 Kings. And we have the little southern boy named JJ, and he says, "Hi, Ma." So you look at the J's in the minor prophets. Joel and Jonah are given probably in this period of time. And then Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, and Amos are all contemporaries. And as we say about our major prophets, as you move through, every time there is a major event in the Old Testament, God raises up a major prophet. And so Isaiah's ministry is going to be from 740 to 700 and right in the middle in 721, the northern 10 tribes are carried into captivity. We're actually finishing events in number 10, and this is Judah alone. And when you look at the time period from Kings, it's a very narrow section from chapters 18 through 25, but a couple of very significant things happen. Jeremiah is going to be the weeping prophet. He's going to be in Jerusalem for all 3 of the times that the city is going to be captured, and a lament is written. And contemporaries with Jeremiah are going to be Zephaniah, and I always remember with the Z, XYZ, Zephaniah keeps saying, the day of the Lord is coming, the end is coming. And he's very, very pronounced and very strong about God's final judgment. And Habakkuk. And like I said, Habakkuk and Job have a lot in common from this point of view. Job looks at all of these, and I think of personal suffering. Occasionally you may hear me say, sometimes individuals and families go through like a Job-like experience. We can just have a series of things happen to us and very legitimately then just start thinking, God, why? Why do you let these things happen to righteous people? One of the great inequities of life is that how many times does a drunk driver hit a sober driver who is innocent and who lives? One of our wonderful young men at Eastside was the same age as our son Luke. And he has gone to see in fact, Dad was a policeman, and Dad always said, if the bar is closed down at 2, you need to be off the road between 2 and 3 because people are going home. He had just gone to see his girlfriend. Here was a kid who was never in trouble, always in the right place, just, you loved having him at church camp and other stuff. He had gone to see his girlfriend, and he's going through South 240, going east. She has been drinking through the night, and if you know where Old General Motors and Tinker Field is, she has been on the wrong side of the interstate since General Motors. She hits him just about Crossroads Mall and kills him. There were 3 trials, and you just imagine being the mother and listening to the policeman say, I got the report, I was close to the airport, I drove 140 miles an hour because I was going to try to take her off the road, but I just missed it by a couple of minutes, and so I reached inside the car and I held him while he died. Can you imagine being the mother and hearing that 3 times? And she took no responsibility at all. And so that's just going to happen in this world. There's going to be inequities and injustices. And Habakkuk stands up and says, God, there is so much evil and so much sin in this city. Why don't you do something? And God says, I am. I'm going to bring the Babylonians and they're going to punish him. And then Habakkuk says, God, they're worse than we are. God says, I know, but I'm also going to punish them. And can I use this term and kind of work with me? I use the term thinking atheists. And what I'm talking about is that some people just emotionally just say, oh, there's no God, or there can't be a God, or God couldn't let that happen. But the people who I describe as thinking atheists, the biggest obstacle to believing in God is the presence of sin and evil in the world. How can there be a good God and be so much that happens that takes place? And so these little books like Habakkuk, which is going to be asking about the nation, anticipate when we come to Job, then Job hasn't done anything to merit what all happens and what takes place to him. And as we're going to see, every time I read through the book of Job, virtually, one of my prayers is, God, please do not let me be like either Eliphaz or Bildad or Zophar when talking with someone who's gone through tragedy, and we'll anticipate that. But these books talk about those great issues that are so important in human life. The little book of Nahum is one of 3 books that's written to nations outside. And again, the sound alike. Nahum is written to Nineveh. Jonah goes to Nineveh about 150 years earlier, and God sends the prophet Nahum, or the writing of Nahum, and says Nineveh is going to fall. Now, where we are into number 11, and this will bring us into the time of the Babylonian exile. Like I said, there are 3 times that the city is captured and taken, or captured and the people are taken away. Daniel is taken away during the first captivity in 606. And then over a period of time, the people rebel again. The Babylonians come back a second time. They capture the city, and Ezekiel is carried away in that 598, 597 group. And then where we're going to be today is that they rebel again. And when you come to this 587 to 586, then the city's actually going to be destroyed. Obadiah writes to the Edomites. You'll hear the D, Obadiah, Edomites. And as God's people are being harassed after the captivity, the Edomites not only are cheering that they're being hunted down by the Babylonians, they actually take advantage of God's people. And God says, you may live up among the mountains and you feel like you're nestled among the stars. I'm going to bring you down. And that's the time period for those particular things there. Now, I want us to turn, if you have your Old Testament, and there's several of these, but I want you to turn to Deuteronomy 27, because something very significant is going to happen today. There is so much confusion in the religious world about how does God want us to practice and worship. And if any of you either are old enough or have watched the Waltons, my grandparents ran a country store 10 miles out from Sayre from 1924 to 1942. So you think we're going to finish World War I, we're going to be there through the Depression, and they finally closed the store down during World War II. And if you take the grandparents and the Waltons and put them in the country store, that's my grandfather and grandmother. In these rural communities, in those days, there was people on every 160, sometimes every 80 acres. And the sad thing was when the tractor came in, one tractor could do what 10 teams of mules could do, and these people gradually starved out. And my grandmother always said, she said, not inflation, if we could have had the money that we loaned for people with tires and gas and fuel to start going to California, we could have retired and never had to work again. So when they finally sold or quit the store, the whole family worked for 5 or 6 years to pay for the gas and the oil and the tires that they had loaned to people that they never saw again, because they became Okies and went to California. My grandfather's running the country store, so he's kind of like the mayor, okay? Not literally, but you know what I'm saying. He was there, he was present. And it may be Roy Lanier Sr., we're not 100% sure. But a man comes through and says, Luther, I would like to put a tent up, and we're going to have a gospel meeting here at New Liberty. And being at the country store, then my granddad was able to do that. He helped him put the tent up. And, you know, if you're the evangelist and you get a guy to help you put the tent up, what do you have to ask him before he leaves? Oh, can you and your wife come tonight? So my grandparents go to this meeting. My grandmother is literally playing the piano and the organ for a religious group literally across the road. So on Sundays, she doesn't even get in the car. She walks across the road and plays the piano and the organ, and my aunt also helps her. My grandfather, when he goes to church where you accept Jesus in your heart and you're saved. And so you can kind of anticipate friends that you know that are like that. So they go to this meeting, and in the meeting, the guy holds up his Bible and he says, what would you be if you just followed what was in this book? That's the thing they remember. Now, Donna, it's easier for you to study for Kelly than it is to study for yourself. And so when they had this discussion, it came up, and my grandfather said, I have looked and I can't find your church in the Bible. And guess what she said? Well, I've been looking and I can't find your church in the Bible either. Well, what are we going to do? Well, we're 10 miles out of town, and we need to go in and find a church that just follows what's in the Bible. And that's how our family becomes New Testament Christians. I mean, literally, can you imagine how hard it is when you're right here and you feed and take care of? Mama Hartman was the, what's the term for a lady that gives birth to children? Midwife. She was the midwife for probably 25 years, and there's a whole generation of kids that were born and didn't have a hospital necessarily, didn't go to town, and Mom Hartman birthed all of these kids. And you've been playing the piano and the organ in this community all these years, and then all of a sudden, you start getting in your vehicle and driving 10 miles into town to go to a church that just follows what's in the Bible. What is really important today about our lesson is that when God makes a covenant, God is absolutely sincere about his part of the covenant, and he expects us to follow that covenant as well. If you look at the top of the sheet, the fall of Jerusalem, this is repeated a number of times. We're just going to read part of this in Deuteronomy 27. Moses says, "Now when you go into the land, I want you to build an altar, and I want you to put plaster on it." You're down in verse 2 and 3. And this is this land flowing with milk and honey. And we're going to be at Mount Ebal in verse 4. And you're going to have the Levites. And then here we are in verse 11, Deuteronomy 27. Moses charged the people the same day, saying, "When you have passed over the Jordan, these standing upon Mount Gerizim to bless the people." So get the picture. There's two mountains that are within proximity of each other. Jacob's well is at the bottom of the intersection of these two mountains. And when God takes you into this promised land, and Moses is not going to be able to go, but when God brings you into this promised land and you kind of have control of it, then you get all the people together, you build an altar, you write in the plaster words of this law, and on Mount Gerizim, these are the tribes that will bless the people. If you follow this covenant and this law, these are the blessings. So Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, Benjamin, all of you tribes, I want you to get on Mount Gerizim. Now the other half of you are to be on Mount Ebal, and here is Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali. And this is going to be the curses if you do not follow this law. How graphic is that? We had a family when we were planting the church in Campbelltown. They were a blended family. We loved having them. Something happened, and I never did figure out, but the last conversation I had with this man was 5 hours. And he said, "My problem with you guys is that you actually believe in the miracles of the Bible." And I said, "You betcha." Because we had talked about crossing the Red Sea, okay? I was just being a little bit lighthearted, but if you're 12 years old and you're crossing the Red Sea, would you be tempted to do that at least once if you were a little guy? And we had just talked about it, and then the water comes in. He said, "That didn't happen. It was just kind of a marshy place, and the Egyptians got bogged down, and that didn't happen." Well, like I said, this was a 5-hour conversation. Finally, he said, "I'm not even sure Jesus was raised from the dead. It's all just a symbol. And the problem with you guys is that you actually believe these things happened." And I said, "Yes." And when they make the covenant with the people, and this is very significant, Deuteronomy 24 and verse 8, Moses literally hurls blood on the people closest to them. And the people say, "All the words of this law we will keep." God keeps his part of that covenant from the foot of Mount Sinai to the foot of the cross. And so we're going to be about 1,500, and for 1,500 years, God was faithful to his part of the covenant. Do you remember what we read last week in Jeremiah? "The days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their fathers." What's the nature of this covenant? "I will write my law on their hearts, and on their inward parts, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. And friends, God is faithful to that covenant from the cross until Jesus comes back. And all kinds of people today are doing things religiously that they can't find in the Bible. Can't find the church in the Bible, can't find what they're going to do in worship in the Bible, and they just kind of shrug and say, well, I think God will understand. But when God makes a covenant, God gives very specific instructions. This is what I want you to do. For those of you who've read through Lamentations and some of this, how hard is it to read about women eating their children because they're starving to death? And what you'll find is that when you read in Deuteronomy and Leviticus 26, and these are just samples that are listed across the top, God says 1,500 years at the cross, we're at Mount Sinai, and we're going to be 1,000 years later into the 500s if you do not keep the words of this covenant. Here are the curses that are going to take place. And 1,000 years later, the covenant that they broke, that they would not keep, 1,000 years later, the curses that are read, and you'll find these, like I said, specifically, Gerizim is the blessing, Ebal is the curses, and the curses that were read 1,000 years earlier come to pass. Now, let me say one other thing, and obviously we'll have to highlight some things in our outline. When I think of biblical doctrine, I think of a Boy Scout tent, and I'm thinking of a pup tent. And for a pup tent to stand up with that pole in the center, both sides have to be held in tension, right? And if one of the cords drops, then the tent falls down. How many of us have talked with people, oh, he is just a good and loving God, and virtually feel like everybody's going to go to heaven? And we've talked with people like that. He's just a loving God. And then occasionally, he's an angry God, and we're in the hands of this angry, vengeful God. And biblical truth is holding two things in equal tension, that if you neglect one and overstate the other, then the tent falls down. And when I hear people, and again, Jesus is very specific, and don't be offended, I'm not talking about any of you, but just listen carefully. Jesus says, don't throw your pearls before pigs. He told the teachers, the disciples about some of the Pharisees, leave them alone. The Lord's servant is not to be quarrelsome. But if I get a chance to talk with someone and they want to talk about this angry, vengeful God of the Old Testament, I want to try to tell them, but look at all the prophets that he sent. And look at all the things that he did to the prophets. And it was only after he had done this and 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 this that finally the city is destroyed. Rather than going back and seeing this angry, vengeful God in the Old Testament who's just capricious and wanting to strike people down, you can also find a loving, patient God, and that term steadfast love, God's covenant love, is very, very essential. Okay, now that we've introduced things today, let's jump in and I'll leave you to read several of these things. By the time the city's destroyed, the people have lost what I call their spiritual identity and their moral compass. And in fact, and this is hard for me to say, God's people are morally worse than the people that were destroyed when Joshua came in the land. So whatever the people were doing in terms of idolatry and immorality, that God finally said, okay, we're going to give you this land and we're going to destroy these people. Now, God's people are worse than the people were when they came in. And that's just even hard to imagine. I love this little expression, this is 1:1. My people don't know how to blush. And just think about that. Through media, TV, movies, songs, we can come conditioned to a level of immorality that we just kind of accept it and don't blush. And one of those statements about the heart of God's people was that they're not offended by immorality or idolatry. And that's something I always just stop and pause and think about. When you look at 1:2 and look at these people, how bad is it? If Moses or Samuel stood before me and would not turn this people, and then he says, this is Jeremiah 15, Ezekiel 24, if Noah, Daniel, and Job were here, they would deliver their lives, but they wouldn't deliver the people. I just shudder when I read 1:3. Don't pray for them. Isn't that even hard to read? They have just sinned over and over and over and over again. And may I just paraphrase, and God says, don't waste your breath. There has come a point of time where my patience has finally ran out, and we're about to pass into judgment. Now, I say this lightheartedly, and Glenn will know what I'm saying. When my mother called us by all three names, and especially we heard Marshall Kent Hartman, that was the name we heard the most often. And so something would happen, and she would say, Marshall Kent Hartman. Okay, you're still kind of okay. But it was that third time. It was the level of the voice and the tone. You knew you were about to pass from grace to judgment. And so when my mom called all three names that third time at a certain level, you had better get on pronto because grace and mercy were over. Well, spiritually, this is what's happened here. God's people, after refusing prophet after prophet after prophet, God finally says, don't pray for them. Even hard to read. Number 4, and I wish you knew me better because I could be misunderstood, but let me say it this way. One of the blessings that we have is that in a nation where we can vote for people, none of the people that we vote for are going to be perfect. And we used to write bulletin articles, and when I would write a bulletin article around election time, I would say, the church doesn't give us advice on who to vote for. That's not our place, talking about a political party. But let's just assume that there's elephants and there's donkeys and there's giraffes, okay? So there's 3 different parties that are running. If I'm looking at the giraffe candidate, one of the things I am going to ask myself as a Christian is, what do they believe about abortion? It's a whole group of other things, but let me just use the term abortion for an illustration. Let me tell you in a sentence what we're going to read. When God finally destroys Jerusalem, it's because the shedding of innocent blood. Do you remember when they did the 6 cities of refuge? When you come into the land, you put 3 cities on this side of the Jordan, you put 3 cities on the other side of the Jordan, and if you find someone who's dead, the elders of the city come out and they check on this. They offer a sacrifice because of the shedding of innocent blood. And in the Old Testament, it's not just babies. It's just people who are innocent. One of the most dangerous places to be in the United States today is in a mother's womb. And there are people just with no moral compunction at all say, well, even we can let the baby be born and we can have a conference and see if we're going to save the baby or not. I'll just encourage you, this is my perspective. Regardless of whether I'm an elephant, a donkey, or a giraffe, as a Christian, knowing what we're about to read, one of the things that I consider before I vote for someone is where do they stand on the taking of innocent life. Now, when you go back and look, and this is under 1:4, it's Manasseh. And Manasseh, this is the tragedy. Do you remember Hezekiah? It's going to be both in Kings and in Isaiah. Godly king, God sends Isaiah to him, and God says, you go tell Hezekiah to get his house in order, he's going to die. Hezekiah turns his face toward the wall, he prays fervently to God. God answers the prayer and tells the prophet, you come back and you tell him, I'm going to give him 15 years. And so God answers the prayer of Hezekiah, the godly king, and gives him 15 years. When he dies, his son Manasseh becomes the king, and Manasseh is 12 years old. So what does that tell you? Manasseh is born the third year of this 15-year period of grace, and the boy is a certified pagan from day one. And when you read through these accounts, and you'll be in 1 Kings 21, 2 Kings 24, that probably should be 2 Kings 21. Look at the bold. Manasseh shed very much innocent blood until he had filled Jerusalem from one end to the other. God is going to take him into captivity. He's going to come back, but he is going to reign for 55 years. Isn't that tragic? And for all the good things that Hezekiah did, being so busy with helping and doing the things of God, his son, who became the next king, goes down as one of the most wicked kings, and so much innocent blood is shed during the time of Manasseh that at a point in time God says, we're going to destroy this whole city. So look at the final one that's underlined here in Jeremiah 19. The people have forsaken me. They have profaned this place by burning incense to other gods, which neither they nor their fathers or the kings of Judah had known. They just keep adding gods and idolatry all along the way. And because they have filled this place with the blood of innocents and have built high places to Baal to burn their sons in the fire as offering, which I didn't command, and it never came to my mind that they would do that. And I just want you to kind of see that before we turn the page, because God is going to allow Jerusalem to be destroyed that final time. They're going to break down the walls. They're going to burn the temple. But do you remember earlier Ezekiel, the priest who becomes a prophet in captivity? Ezekiel has had a vision, and the glory of God has left the temple. God has finally said, I'm sorry, I'm out of here. I'm leaving. And the glory of God that filled the temple back in the time of Solomon leaves, and the whole city is about to pay a terrible price. Okay, look at the back page. And you'll find these references again, 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. Very specific time is given for what take place. The city is besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And let me mention something to those of you who are online, and we so appreciate your being with us. If you go to the announcements that are online, the bulletin type each week, there's a link for the outlines. And when we start next week, we're going to come to Josiah, Jehoaz, Jehoiachin, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah. And we're going to look just briefly at all of those last kings, and we're going to have Josiah, and there's going to be 3 sons who are either going to be killed and taken captivity, and a grandson. And remember, God is going to promise David, one of your descendants is going to reign on the throne. Twice, as we're going to see next week, the promise is down to one heartbeat. Athaliah earlier decides she's going to wipe out all the sons, and the nurse does what? She grabs this little baby boy, and they race off so he doesn't get killed, and they turn the temple into a playpen. She is such a witch. She is so evil. The one place that she is never going to go is the temple. And I always just laugh because can you imagine trying to hide a 5-year-old little boy? You turn around and he's just going to, run off and be doing something. And they hide him for 6 years in the temple. We're down to one heartbeat. After Josiah, we're going to have 3 sons that are going to be killed. Zedekiah, this is just, you just shudder. Zedekiah runs away after they have broken down the walls. They capture him. They bring him to Riblah, where Nebuchadnezzar is. And Nebuchadnezzar lines his sons up before him. And the last thing that he sees is that each of his sons are killed. And then Nebuchadnezzar puts his eyes out and carries him to Babylon. And this is the king who's reigning when the city's destroyed. And I just shudder when I read that. I mean, just imagine the last thing that you see is the death of your sons, and then your eyes are put out, and all of his sons are killed. What's going to happen to the promise? Oh, God has sent a little boy into Babylon who's the grandson of Josiah. And so then you're going to have Jeconiah, Shealtiel, Zerubbabel, Abiud, Eliakim, Azor, Zadok, Eliud, Eliezer, Mattan, Jacob, who was the son of Joseph, who was the father of Jesus. And the line that God promised to David is going to continue, but twice it's down to one heartbeat of a little bitty boy, and God preserves that line. So if you're with us next week, we want to be sure to look at that chart, because here we are with the evil of the destruction, and this is what God's going to do. If you look at the bold, about a third of the way down, Nebuchadnezzar burned the house of the Lord. Every great house he burned. The army of the Chaldeans broke the walls down, and they just leave some of the poorest of the land. So when you come to the book, and there's questions, but I still think of Jeremiah. When you look at the book of Jeremiah, there's continued warnings, and bless his heart, he's disregarded, he's beaten, he's imprisoned, he's thrown into a well, he's ridiculed. And this lovely book of Lamentations, the warning that Jeremiah gives, the city's destroyed, and I literally just do this with tear ducts, then Lamentations is a lament about the fall of Jerusalem. Now, we won't see this in English, but this is still helpful to know. When you look at the writing of Lamentations, the first line of chapters 1, 2, and 4 form an acrostic in that if you're reading them in Hebrew, let's do English, they start with A, and then with B, and then with C. And you stop and think, if you have 22 letters of an alphabet, I would have to have 2 or 3 pages, a thesaurus, a dictionary, and look at this, it's pretty easy till you get to X, Y, and Z. So if you're writing this in English, what words in X, Y, and Z are you going to use to start the line? And this happens in chapters 1, chapters 2, and chapters 4. Chapter 3, the first 3 verses are A. The second 3 verses are B. The third 3 verses are C, using English to describe what's going on in Hebrew. And here is a very detailed, it makes my head hurt to try to think of writing this. But it's very, very structured, and a lot of details are actually there. How many of you personally saw the Murrah building after the bombing took place? Will you ever forget it? I took our early teenage children one night, and I said, I just want you to see something with your eyes. And one of the things that we have talked about is that we know the suffering of what happens with the loss of one building. What if that was the entire city of Oklahoma City? You understand what I'm trying to say? If you can just imagine the loss and the tears that we all suffered who were here because of the loss of one building, then if you just start multiplying that and then you just include our entire city, that's what happens in the book of Lamentations. I'm down to the dots. There's going to be what I call a ray of sunshine, and I always look for these. We've all seen a really cloudy day, and then in the horizon, the last one I saw was in the east. In the horizon, there's just like an opening in the clouds, and this shaft of sunlight just kind of going shoo, and just screams down. Sometimes in the evening during sunsets, we'll see these just rays of light. And I'm confident of this, and I'm not trying to be either elitist or anything else. Recently on a Wednesday night, we sang "The Steadfast Love of the Lord Never Ceases." It's such a wonderful song. The majority of people have no idea that the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases is in the middle of one of the most sad and tragic and emotional books in the Old Testament. I don't have any trouble with our singing it. I don't have any trouble with how it's written. but most people have no idea where the song actually came from. The message is wonderful. And a lot of times when I'm reading through Lamentations, then I think of those times. Here's a fairly dark, dreary day, and that little opening comes up, and just this ray of sunlight just comes screaming through the heavens. And when you look at this, here is Jeremiah, and again, people are starving to death. And again, it's hard to imagine. They are literally starving to death. And Habakkuk is going to say, I will wait quietly for the day of trouble to come upon us. And in the middle of this absolute tragedy that could have been prevented, they could have repented, but they wouldn't. Then notice what is said. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. And see, when you see this term, and I'm sure even recently people are conscious of the size of the portions of what they eat. You know, we've all had people go to a restaurant and say, oh, may I have just have half of that. When there's nothing to eat physically, literally, then the prophet says, the Lord is my portion. And that always just kind of strikes me in that physically, we don't have anything to eat. People are starving to death. But spiritually, even in an environment like that, the Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him. To the soul that seeks him, it is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. The word, and I'm glad we use this in our song, the term steadfast love is a covenant word. The same way that when we have a wedding, do you promise? And yes, I promise. And steadfast love is this covenant word. Sometimes your translations will have the word loving kindness. That's good. There's about 6 or 7 words that are used here. In Australia, when a youngster was misbehaving, the term was cheeky. You are a cheeky little boy, and it has to do with kind of rude and inappropriate or whatever. And I go down to our Italian family to buy some milk one morning, and this little kid, Mom is taking strips off him verbally. It's all in Italian. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And right in the middle of it, she says, and you are a cheeky boy. And then she goes right back into Italian, because there wasn't anything in Italian that just quite said, you are a cheeky boy. And she just had to, that's the only part I understood. I mean, I could tell from the tone, this kid was in real deep trouble. And if you know Italians, they're pretty emotional anyway. And Mom was just going on and on and on and on. And then right in the middle, she says, and you are a cheeky boy. Every language has limitations that we can't quite say the whole thing. There's more there. When I think of steadfast love, I think of the term love with loyalty. Who but God is going to keep a covenant for 1,000 years when over and over the people break it? And that's why, as we said last week, rather than the covenant being based on us, the Hebrew writer says the new covenant is based on the power of an indestructible life. It's based on Jesus. And God's steadfast love that he kept for 1,000 years with the people of Israel is the steadfast love he's going to keep with us until Jesus comes back. That's the nature of God. The last part, and this is my vote for one of the saddest parts of the Old Testament. Jerusalem's destroyed. Gedaliah becomes the governor. People come in from the outside. He doesn't believe they will do this. They assassinate the governor. And Jeremiah keeps saying, do not go to Egypt. Stay here. Do not go to Egypt. They kill the governor, and then they take Jeremiah by force, and they drag him off to Egypt. When they get to Egypt, the women especially, but the men as well, Jeremiah still tries to speak to them. They say, look, when we sacrificed to the Queen of Heaven, everything was fine. See, these are God's people. I read this and I just literally touch my head and think, I just can't hardly believe this. Here are God's people. And the wives are saying, our husbands knew we did this. We did cakes. We burned incense. We worshiped her on the roof. And as long as we worshiped the Queen of Heaven, everything was fine. But you came and started talking to us about God, and we've had trouble ever since. Can you imagine? And that's why when I think of Jeremiah, I just very clearly think of this weeping prophet and how tragic. Stay in Jerusalem. Don't leave. Don't leave. And for all these years, he's been persecuted. He's been beaten. He's been thrown in a well. And at the very end, by force, they take this noble prophet from Jerusalem down into Egypt. And the very thing he has told them again and again, do not do, do not do. Not only do they do it, but they drag him off with them. And while they're there, and you can read this in Jeremiah 44, they just abuse him verbally all the time. And they basically say, you are the problem. And you came and started talking about God. And we've had trouble ever since. Heartbreaking. But Jeremiah was faithful. And that's what I told a family in Australia when they said, the world is so bad, we can't have children. And I just cryptically told them, you've never read the Old Testament.